Africa historically, sub-Saharan Africa has been fundamental to the global prosperity of the advanced countries. Okay? And Africa had a role to play. It has a role as a raw material producer. We will not allow sub-Saharan Africa to escape that. Okay, we do everything to keep sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished.
Hello and welcome back. Meet Professor Dr. Howard Nicholas, a distinguished development economist and senior lecturer in economics at the International Institute of Social Sciences, ISS, within Erasmus Universities in the Netherlands. A video of his public lecture given in 2015 has been doing the rounds on social media. In this video, Professor Howard brutally explained how and why the advanced countries ensures Africa stays poor and begging for the sake of survival of the rich developed world. Sub-Saharan Africa has been fundamental to the global prosperity of advanced countries. Therefore, it has to be kept poor. And this is vital to the prosperity of the West. And if it is, how is this agenda achieved? Now, let's start by looking at the root cause, by looking at the why. Why would anyone want to keep Africa poor? Raw materials. According to Professor Howard, Western Europe and North America are bent on keeping sub-Saharan Africa impoverished by condemning it to a raw material producer.
Absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else. So let's get clear about that. Okay, and this means all the economic structures, all the global institutions, and the economics we teach everyone is all designed to keep Africa exactly where it is. And whether it is Europe or US or now China, it's always the same. We need Africa to be impoverished because we need those raw materials and we need them dirt cheap. Okay, so that's the message. It doesn't mean to say that there's nothing Africans can do. Of course there is. Okay? But this is the opposition that they're fighting. This is what it's about. Because if Africa does do something different, I assure you living standards of all those in Europe and North America and Asia is going to fall. Okay? And that is a big price to pay. I assure you that the West is not going to allow that without a big fight. Okay, so this is what it's fundamentally about.
In this speech, he identified the 6 ways the West uses to keep Africa poor and underdeveloped. Furthermore, in this video, he also portrayed the attitudes of the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, educational systems towards Africa and other developing countries, but most especially sub-Saharan Africa.
What I want to show you is how these structures are operating, but just to give you a little bit of an idea, and why I keep the ideology part there is because we are part of the producers of ideology. At universities and academic institutions, we are complicit in this whole enterprise. Okay, so the job of many Western academics is to convince Africans they have to keep doing what they're doing. Okay? And to show them, it's your fault that you're poor. It's not our fault. It's your fault that you're poor. The extent to which Africa is specializing in the production of raw materials and basic agricultural goods. Here, just to have a look at one very important additional statistic, with all this export coming from sub-Saharan Africa, how much does sub-Saharan Africa account for in terms of global trade value? We know there are vast resources coming from there, but look at the bottom line in terms of global trade value. Look at that. 0.5%, 1975, 0.95% going down to 0.1. To 0.1. Meaning that with all these vast resources being produced, how much are they getting for it? Nothing. Then I just want to show you what has happened to sub-Saharan Africa, because what we know, and from all studies, no country ever develops without manufacturing. Okay, producing raw materials will not take you anywhere. Producing basic agricultural goods will not take you anywhere. This is deliberate because we will never, as Western economists, as Western policymakers, we cannot afford to allow Africa to industrialize and start producing manufactures. Okay, so we will do everything to stop that. And I'm going to show you how we actually block that. It's obvious in certain ways, but it's less obvious in other ways. Okay, so relative to the rest of the world, sub-Saharan Africa is going to suffer. Again, why? Because it's condemned to this raw material production. This is basically why.
Now, how do they make this happen? Now, let us look at the 6 structures in place that keeps sub-Saharan Africa as a purely raw material provider. Firstly, let's look at foreign aid. This is where aid is given to keep repressive regimes in power and enforce the advanced nations' agendas. The West provides money and guns to keep them in power. You see, since colonization, it has been vital to keep puppets in place that serve the interests of the advanced nations instead of their own national interests. So leaders that wanted what was best for Africa were, for instance, eliminated, and those in favor of the West propped up and put in places to advance the interests of the corporations and foreign interests.
How is it condemned to that? Well, the first and most important is the economic structures. After colonization ended, we needed new structures to keep these countries where they were. Okay? And the first of those is aid. Okay? We give them aid. Aid for what? Actually, we give them aid to keep repressive regimes in power. That's all. Okay? We're not giving them aid for much more except a little bit of infrastructure to make sure those raw materials get to the ports and aren't gotten out of the ground. But for the most part, we give repressive regimes money and power and guns to keep that system going. This is what it's fundamentally about. All the hypocrisy about transparency and democracy and bullshit like that, it's all bullshit. You know? And at least the Chinese don't enter into that bullshit. They say, we don't care about the whole political environment, we just give the money. Okay? And it's for raw material extraction.
Secondly, let's look at debt and foreign loans. Now, by using foreign debt and the shackles of economic control, they're able to control these countries by these foreign loans. In this scenario, money is lent to raw material producing countries. Is gained, control is then gained over these countries' mineral resources, and the vicious circle continues. Benefit wealthy nations and large banks in exerting influence over post-colonial countries. And these actions have trapped these nations being burdened with unsustainable debt circles due to loan extended with high interest rates. 16% is spent towards debt repayment, resulting in their inability to invest adequately in crucial public services, social protection, and healthcare. And when the leaders in these countries refuse the terms and conditions set, economic hitmen will then be sent out to have these leaders executed who refuse to accept the loans or conditions set out for them. Accept or get deposed or executed.
Okay. Number 2, and this was a very important one, still is debt. I was telling some of my students today, was it today or yesterday, about Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You remember this? Have any of you heard of this one? Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It's a book written by John Perkins, who used to work for a very nebulous, opaque bank. No one had ever heard of this bank, but it was formed in the 1950s by the IMF, the CIA, and the American State Department. And it had only one job to lend money to developing countries that were raw material producers in order to indebt them. Once you are in my debt, I control you. Okay? And this bank had 4,000 employees. But no one ever heard of this bank, you see. But it would go to country after country offering loans. And if the president did not accept the loan, they were killed. And he gives 2 examples of presidents who were killed when they did not accept the loan. You see, the lending is also very important to trap the country. It's very important. It's part of that process. I teach in Suriname. And Suriname in recent times had a huge foreign exchange reserve. So big they didn't need to borrow money. And then one of my students who was very high up in government, he said, you know, the IMF is trying to convince us to borrow money from foreigners. Why? I thought, duh, you know, sorry about this, but, you know, this is the game. And in the end, Suriname did borrow this money because the IMF said, if foreigners lend to you, then everyone will think Suriname is such a strong economy that foreigners are interested in lending to you. You understand? Before Lula came to power, you know, the previous president in Brazil, Cardoso, his predecessor, took a gigantic international loan. No necessity for taking the loan. Why? Because once I catch you with the debt strings, I hold you forever. You are my prisoner. Okay, so debt has been this huge spider's web which has trapped sub-Saharan Africa and keeps them held there. Aid, debt.
Thirdly, monopoly. Buying structures, exploiting economic vulnerabilities. So when we look at monopoly buying structures, entrenched control mechanisms, further with buyers monopolizing the purchase of vital commodities from developing countries. By dictating prices and trade terms of the developing countries, a monopoly determines not only the quantity to produce but also the price it will charge. Monopoly buying structures continue to be used today to control the economies of the developing countries. For example, the top 10 multinational corporations control the global market for many commodities in what we buy every day in supermarkets and retail. Then, monopoly buying structures and the multinationals collude while the WTO looks the other way.
We have a third structure which is again not known by many people, but it's something that was put in place and continues to this very day, with no one discussing it. No one says anything about it. It is monopoly buying structures. This is for all raw materials and basic agricultural goods produced by developing countries. There are only 4 or 5 Western multinationals that buy all those goods. And they collude between them. So if you take any major product, these Western multinationals, they collude between them. Even if we go down to banana production, we had a PhD done here at the ISS, and the person showed that the 4 or 5 major multinationals, they collude, and in order to make sure their control is total, what they do is they force all the producers to produce the same uniform banana. You know, the crap you buy in the West and has no taste at all. You go to any developing country, you know how a banana tastes, don't you? There's so many of them, lots of varieties, but we only market 1 or 2 types, so we have control, you see. If you don't produce at the price I want you to produce, I go to the next country. You see, we get control. So these buyers, they impose that control, and they keep pushing the prices down and down and down. Okay, this is the game. No one says anything about it. There are no commissions of inquiry to say, this is illegal what you're doing. The WTO has nothing to say about this. But sorry to say, you know, if banana prices rose 10 times, especially for people like me who love bananas, okay, I protest. I like my living standards. Okay? It's the same with all the other raw materials, you see. We're all benefiting, we're complicit. We're actually complicit in this because we will protest and shout out if the situation ever changed.
Fourthly, let's look at the international economic institutions. Now, this is where the international organizations such as the Bretton Woods institutions are created to control and keep the developing countries in check by keeping them producing only raw materials, ensuring that these countries that receive IMF World Bank loans don't get out of a recurrent balance of payment problems. The IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organizations are created by advanced countries who are given enormous political influence and control of African governments and economics.
We come to those international institutions, and I must tell you this from the outset, don't think of them as wicked. IMF, World Bank, WTO. We always think evil creatures, horrible. It's not. It's just economics. It's economic warfare. The rich declare war on the poor. It happens everywhere. It happens in a country. The rich control the government. Of course they do. You really believe you have democracy? Come on. You know, I mean, grow up. This is not about people living in democratic systems. What we have is the rich control. The rich set up these institutions explicitly to control the poor countries. And they don't give them much room for maneuver. Which incidentally, when the IMF starts talking of poverty alleviation, you should also understand that there's another game there also starting to play, which I'm going to come back to later. But what do these institutions do? What does the IMF do? What is structural adjustment about? It's about making sure countries keep producing what we want them to produce. We make sure they have recurrent balance of payments problems. You notice these countries never get out of balance of payments problems. You notice that? Whereas countries that never took IMF support are always out of balance of payments problems. But the countries that are continuously getting advice and support by the IMF, they're always in balance of payments problems. Why? Because that's the way we keep our stranglehold on them. And that's what we have done. We have done, the IMF and the World Bank. And they've also done something very, very important.
5. We talk about the destruction of food sufficiency in Africa started during colonization and was continued on after colonization by the World Bank. Professor Nicholas argues that the IMF strategy is to destroy the self-sufficiency of dependent countries. And once you don't produce your own food, the Bretton Woods institutions increase their control on you as a country. For instance, let's look at Monsanto's biotech tentacles that are strangling our food systems in Africa. Today, 5 corporations, Cargill, Bayer, Corteva, ChemChina, and Lima Grain, control more than 50% of the world's grains. Now, these staggering monopolies dominate the global food supply.
Also done something very, very important. And that is they have destroyed the self-sufficiency of these countries. Colonization started it. Okay? One of the most important things is we destroy food self-sufficiency. Okay? And the World Bank continued it. They forced most countries to eliminate all food subsidies and food support. Okay? Because once you don't produce your own food, I increase my control over you. How do we know this? Well, very funny thing happened some years ago. Not so funny, actually. It involved starvation of a large number of people in Malawi. Okay? Many of you could remember this because it was really tragic. But the Malawian finance minister, who was under terrible threat at the time, suddenly broke ranks and he said, well, you know why we had this famine? Because one of the conditions of the loan given by the World Bank was we destroyed all our grain surplus stocks. Why? Because remember, we want you dependent. 1970s, the US Senate, the US Congress said, we will not allow Latin America to produce their own food. We will start a strategy involving the IMF and the World Bank to destroy food self-sufficiency of Latin America. Then they will indeed be our true backyard. And that's exactly what they've done. Look at all the Latin American countries. Look at them. They used to be food self-sufficient, but they're no longer food self-sufficient. Now here comes the kicker. This is the beautiful part of it. I congratulate them. You know, I admire them because they do it so well. Okay? I know it sounds really perverse, but we have now in the WTO something called the Agreement on Agriculture. Okay? You know what that Agreement on Agriculture states? It says, if you don't have any subsidies, you're not allowed to put these subsidies on food. But if you have subsidies and income support for food production, you can keep them. Who has all the subsidies and income support? US, Europe. The largest budgets in the world for supporting their farmers are Europe and US. But the World Bank and IMF have destroyed all those subsidies. You see, all those subsidies have been destroyed. And now we're telling these countries, you don't have subsidies? Tough luck. You know? You see, we're keeping them dependent. We're keeping them on a string. I have 5 minutes, so I have to be choosy about what I say next. We have lots of examples in the WTO to really stop Africa industrializing. This is the crucial thing. We cannot allow them to produce manufacturers. It's not difficult. Trust me, it's not difficult. We need nationalist governments. We need them committed to industrialization, and it won't take them a decade to move out from where they are. This is the fundamental point. It's not difficult. But this next round of the WTO is designed to block that. If we had time, I would go through all the different things that they're trying to put into place to block anyone else getting on top of the ladder. You've read this book of Hajun Chang, Kicking Away the Ladder. You see, when we become rich, we make sure the others can't climb up the ladder and join us. Okay? And this is what this next Doha round is about. It's to make sure, especially sub-Saharan African countries, do not escape.
Lastly, but not the least, 6. Educational curriculums. In particular, the ideology of comparative advantage, as well as saying that the only reason Africa is the way it is because of corruption. Comparative advantage. This ideology says that for countries to have comparative advantage, they must produce a particular good or service at a lower opportunity cost than its trading partners. In the case of Africa, that will be raw material production for the advanced countries. And in this case, it means we are at a disadvantage if we manufacture.
This economic ideology thing, because this is important for academics. You see, we teach, in many cases, garbage. And it doesn't hurt anyone, a lot of this garbage. You know, sometimes we teach very destructive things. And no more important than when we're teaching people from developing countries. Okay, and one of those very damaging and destructive things is the doctrine of comparative advantage. It's a lie from beginning to end. It's utter crap. It has been decimated many times, but we keep it in every curriculum. Why? Because it tells sub-Saharan African countries that their destiny is to produce raw materials, you see. And if you produce raw materials, you get rich just like we are in the West. You see, this is the game we're playing. And just for you to be totally confused, we normally build models with it, mathematical models, so you really have no idea what we're talking about. But it seems all very scientific. Then we have the modern version of this is because it's all a failure, we know it's a failure, we now have a new generation of economists saying, It's only a failure because you're all corrupt in your countries. We call that new institutional economics. You've all probably learnt it all, but you didn't know why they invented it. It was invented to tell you the same thing. You should keep producing raw materials. Now, don't be as corrupt as you were before. Nobody ever told you that aid was designed to actually start the corruption process in the first place. Okay, and we need corruption to make sure you're doing all these things. But now we blame the victim. You're poor because it's your fault, basically. And you're poor, stupid, and corrupt, basically. This is the message that we're giving people. We also have many theoretical justifications, but I'm going to say something controversial to end. And that is, there are also what I call more enlightened approaches, but which are also potentially destructive for sub-Saharan African development. And this is where I come back to the IMF and the World Bank. You see, now they're all into poverty alleviation. They want you to concentrate on redistributing income, and it's something nice. You're young people, you're socially conscious, you're aware. You don't like all this injustice. So you gravitate towards what we call pro-poor strategies. But actually, I'm sorry to tell you, that is not what Africa needs. Africa needs aggressive industrialization. When China was a communist country and we had equal distribution, who feared China? Who took them seriously? They weren't even the size of the Netherlands. But today, I can't open an internet site, I can't open a magazine, I can't open a newspaper without China, 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 China. And we know what has built China. It's not socialism or communism, it's capitalism, guys. It's manufacturing, it's production. This is what creates employment, this is what created jobs. I'm not pro-capitalist, but this is the reality, and unfortunately, we're now going to get caught with the good cop, bad cop. The good cop is now IMF saying, oh, you must concentrate on poverty reduction and income redistribution, as long as we can take you away from industrialization. This is the crucial thing.
So that's it for this video, guys. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.